The first unit of our class on comparative politics is all about state development. But what do we actually mean by states? In this video, I'm going to walk you through the common definitions of some of the basic concepts that we're going to be working with here. So there's no single accepted definition of what a state is, but when we talk about states, we're usually talking about formal political institutions, organizations like bureaucracies and legal systems. States have defined territories and are recognized as the authority of those territories by other states. You're going to know which state you belong to because there are formal laws of citizenship. Finally, the main function of state institutions is to deliver public goods. States collect taxes and use them to provide security, infrastructure, and other services to their citizens. This is in contrast to nation, which when we talk about them here, we're talking about nations as groups of people. Defining nations is even more controversial than defining states, but members of a nation usually have some kind of cultural connection to each other. This connection may be based on a claim of shared history. It might be ethnic or religious ties, but it doesn't have to be. Many multi-ethnic states, like the United States, will promote a form of civic nationalism as opposed to ethnic nationalism. Members of a nation might be geographically concentrated in certain areas, but nations are not defined by their territories. Nations are defined by their identities, whatever they may be, and membership in a nation is a matter of group identification. As with all identities, this is mostly a matter of how individuals choose to identify themselves, but the perception of other people also play a role. Some nations are easier to belong to, they're more porous than others, and some ideas of what nations are more contested than others. Finally, rather than providing specific services, nations tend to provide a sense of belonging, a connection to other members and to the institutions that say they represent those members. Not every group is a nation, though. Nations have political goals. They might claim or aspire to statehood, they might seek formal representation within a state, or they might just organize politically for cultural rights. The difference between nations and states matters because their history is extremely bloody. Wars often erupt where the borders between states and nations don't coincide. For example, let's take a look at this map of the country of Bosnia-Herzegovina before and after its civil war. When Bosnia was part of communist Yugoslavia, it was extremely ethnically diverse. But with the end of communism in the early 1990s, many leaders turned to ethnic nationalism to find a new way to gain popular support. This idea that the only people who belong in our country are people who share our same ethnicity and religion led to a series of civil wars. In Bosnia, around 100,000 people were killed, and you saw a country where ethnic groups were highly mixed geographically within the country become a place where you do see Serbs living in Serb areas, Croats living only in Croat areas, and Muslims living in Muslim areas. In addition, there are many groups today that might consider themselves nations, but do not have their own states, the Kurds being the most famous example. I wanted to just take a break here for a second and define a term that I just snuck in there, public goods. There is an extremely technical definition for what a public good is, but essentially it has two characteristics. First is called non-exclusion. Essentially, this is once something is created, everyone can have access to it, regardless of whether they actually contributed to its creation. The other part of it is called non-rivalry, and that idea is that you can't actually just use it up. But non-exclusion is what's most important here. Public goods can be tangible items, like roads or health clinics, or they can be more intangible, like a concept like national defense. This is in contrast to club goods, which you can exclude people from. For example, a toll road or a subscription video streaming service. When we talk about states, we typically focus on two key concepts that states and their leaders aspire to: legitimacy and sovereignty. Legitimacy is the idea that citizens accept that a state or a leader has the right to act in a certain way. Consent of the governed is an element of authority, But accepting an authority as legitimate doesn't necessarily mean you chose it or you support it. Legitimacy is more than just compliance, however. Governments may have legal authority to take actions, but still be seen as illegitimate. So essentially, it is a combination of a moral and legal agreement on what is acceptable. And yes, it's really vague, but that's kind of the best we got. Sovereignty is the idea that a state is recognized as the sole legitimate authority over a territory. There are two key elements to this idea: autonomy and recognition. First, on autonomy, the idea is that sovereign states are the sole authority over their territory. This often is challenged today by transnational or subnational movements. For example, the European Union limits the sovereignty of its member states. Eurozone members cannot establish independent monetary policies, among other things. And you'll also see in Europe regional independence movements, like in Scotland or Catalonia, challenging the idea that their capital should actually tell them what they do. So when members of the Trump administration describe their foreign policy as a sovereignty-based foreign policy, this is what they're talking about. They're not interested in having international organizations or treaties restrain how the United States can act. They want U.S. policy alone to be the sole defining measure. The other aspect of sovereignty is recognition. And here we're typically talking about formal recognition, either legal membership in an international organization, like the UN, or a formal statement by one state that they acknowledge the existence of another. So there are lots and lots of unrecognized states in the world today, ranging from states like Taiwan, which most states do not legally recognize because of opposition from China, to states like Kosovo or Palestine, whose recognition is more contested. And as you can see here, that contestation often will fall along global ideological lines. The last thing I wanted to note for you guys is a distinction I have organized the course around and wanted to just make clear and explicit: the difference between states, regimes, and governments. So we're going to talk about states as a set of formal institutions within a defined territory. We might talk about differences between types of states, but there what we're talking about is something like the degree of centralization. Is this a federal state or a unitary state, for example? By contrast, regimes are about the overall type of political system. There are lots of dimensions we could talk about here, but we're really only going to focus on one, and that's the degree of popular involvement in choosing a leader. Essentially, are we talking about a dictatorship, a democracy, or something that's somewhere in between those? Finally, we're going to use the word government when we talk about how regimes choose their leaders. For example, among democracies, are they presidential or parliamentary? What kind of electoral system do they have? If we're talking about dictatorships, is this a traditional monarchy, or is it a political party-based system? There are important differences among countries in each of these areas, but I have chosen to begin our course with a discussion of the state because it is the fundamental unit of analysis we will be using. It's the playing field that politics takes place in. Understanding how states differ and how those differences arose is the first step towards understanding other political phenomena.